Greek legend tells how Agenor, king of Tyre, had two beautiful children, Cadmus and Europa. Captivated by the grace of Princess Europa, Zeus appeared as a white bull and carried her off over the sea. In despair, her brother Cadmus set off in search of her and sailed the Aegean Sea in vain. In the meantime, the girl had given her name to an entire continent, Europe. This episode sums up Lebanon, a tiny country with a long history, torn between East and West. "5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun is setting over the Hrujla quarry. The din of pickaxes can be heard excavating this little piece of land on the flank of the Lebanon mountains. A handful of men toil away, smashing open the smallest fragment of limestone to examine it, a scrap of memory more than 100 million years old.
Shrimp, eh?
For nearly 10 years now, the young paleontologist Pierre Saad and Samir Aslan, a geologist at the Lebanese University, have been passionately deciphering these traces of marine life fossilized in the rock.
Oh la la! That's great. A shoal of fish, about 20 fish of the same species. Marvelous. It's quite rare to find so many fish in one rock. We usually find this species, but not so many together.
There must be an explanation for the fact that there are exceptional numbers of fossils in certain places. The most plausible hypothesis is that around 100 million years ago, still in the early Cretaceous period, there were whirlpool currents in the sea, which must have sucked in huge numbers of creatures of all sorts and trapped them in marine pockets. Subsequently, these creatures and even plants must have been covered quite quickly with sediment. This rapid burial protected the animals and other organisms against fast decomposition, hence their fossilization, which is an extraordinary phenomenon.
A shellfish, a fish, a stone ghost, an extinct species, skate, squid, urchins, and even sharks, an entire anonymous mute population, telling the story of this land that was to become Lebanon. While fossils have been a continuous source of fascination to scientists for centuries, now it is archaeological remains that fire the human imagination. Some 25 miles north of Beirut, Jebeil, formerly Byblos, embodies the country's sentimental memory. According to ancestral legend, it is the oldest city in the world, where the god El founded the first city of Phoenicia and built a rampart around it. For the archaeologist Hareth Boustani, as for all Lebanese, Byblos is one of those places you could wander round forever, pondering its myths.
It's from here, from the top of the keep of the citadel of Byblos, that you have the best view of the succession of civilizations of the oldest stone-built town in the world. What we see reappearing here is the history of our history. It is our memory, the memory of this people whose origins go back more than 1,000 years. It all began here, around this source of water, which is magical and biblical, and at the same time human. People converged around water, the essence of life and spirituality. Here, the first settlement in the history of this town was established. With a little imagination, we can picture the women with their earthenware jars coming to draw water from this well, and continuing to do so for 8,000 years. This well served generations and generations of this city's inhabitants, up until the 20th century. Of course, in the 20th century, the excavations began, and this area was placed out of bounds. The well had dried up and had to be abandoned.
Few cities have fired the archaeologist's imagination as much as this, the site of the mythological love affair between Adonis and Venus. In 1860, the Frenchman Ernest Renan identified the site from ancient manuscripts and embarked on the first surveys. But the revelations about the town's illustrious past came to light in 1921 under the first blows of Egyptologist Pierre Montet's pick. But it was thanks to the efforts of archaeologist Maurice Dunin that the site has now been almost completely unearthed, after half a century of excavations. From the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, the city was organized, with stone houses grouped along narrow streets. In the center of the city, this people of intrepid seafarers built the great temple of Balat Gubal, the shrine of the Lady of Byblos, dedicated to their guardian goddess. Equipped with 2 ports, one in the south, the other in the north, Byblos became a prosperous city. Surrounded by its strong walls, the town bustled with activity, and its shops were soon bursting with products from the entire Mediterranean basin.
Now this life that had begun to develop in the 3rd millennium was about to explode. It was also the time of the first contact with other civilizations, such as the Egyptians, and of the first trade exchanges, as evidenced by the tombs and in the Egyptian hieroglyphs. This relationship was to last for 3,000 years.
Wedged between Mesopotamia and Egypt, Phoenicia soon became the hub of Mediterranean trade. But its true wealth resided in a tree, which was to come to symbolize its identity, the cedar, whose majestic silhouette once covered the mountainsides. For centuries, the cedar was highly prized by the pharaohs for the construction of their ships and temples, but especially for its resin, so vital for the mummification ritual. We no longer sail to Byblos. How will we obtain the pines whose products we use to bury the pure, whose oils we use to embalm the great? The Egyptians complained at the end of the 3rd millennium. History sometimes takes inexplicable turns. The Egypt of the pharaohs suddenly entered a phase when the contacts with the Levant were brusquely interrupted. Byblos was then destroyed, sometime around the year 2200 BC, according to archaeologists. But at the dawn of the 2nd millennium, the city rose out of its ashes like a phoenix and rebuilt its shrines. A little temple, probably dedicated to the god Reshef, its forest of obelisks soaring upwards like fervent prayers. From the foundations of this shrine, Maurice Dunin excavated hundreds of statuettes of warriors with pinched waists, conical headdresses, and tapering bodies. The worshipper placed them on a stone altar, but when there was no space, the priest hid them away in huge earthenware jars. Covered with a thin layer of gold, which in Egypt was the mark of the gods, they were probably the work of the bronze craftsmen of Byblos. Fragile as matchsticks, slender as Giacometti figures, they symbolize the ambiguity of this Phoenician art, veering between that of Egypt and that of Asia Minor. On the 16th of February 1922, Byblos suffered a terrible flood which produced a giant landslide. A crack appeared in the rocky wall and Pierre Montet discovered the royal necropolis. Although looters had already visited some of these tombs and stripped the sarcophagi bare, two had remained intact, revealing their fabulous treasure. Diplomatic gifts imported from Egypt, opulent Egyptian-style jewels. Local goldsmiths were quick to copy the illustrious models of their powerful neighbours for the elite of their own society. But the most valuable discovery in the eyes of the scientific community was undoubtedly that of the sarcophagus of King Ahiram, the ruler of Byblos, thought to have lived in the 10th century BC. Awe-inspiring, supported by the forms of 4 rampant lions, the coffin provides a detailed account of a royal burial. Weeping women rend their bodices, lacerate their breasts, and tear their hair as a sign of mourning, while a solemn procession advances towards the king, sitting on his throne flanked by winged sphinxes. But the uniqueness of this sarcophagus resides not in its ornamentation, but in the long inscription engraved on the coffin and the edge of the lid. It is in fact the most ancient coherent text in linear alphabetic writing that has survived. It was actually this alphabet that the Phoenicians spread throughout the Levant and beyond, from the 9th century BC. These 22 characters were used for writing Aramaic as well as Hebrew, Greek, and the languages of Transjordan. The source of most of the alphabets currently used in the world, it was the instrument of navigators, merchants, and poets. Around the Mediterranean rim, the cities of the Phoenician coast developed a string of colonies: Cadiz, Utica, Motia, and Carthage. But the wealth of Phoenicia soon aroused the envy of its powerful neighbours. In the 6th century, following the invasions of the Assyrians and Babylonians, it was the Persians' turn to subdue the Phoenician cities, one by one. Sidon, the ancient city of Sidon, even supplied the new masters of the Orient with all the ships and sailors they needed in their bitter struggle against the Greeks and the Egyptians. As a reward, the city was endowed with palaces and gardens, making it a paradise. But alas, they are no more than a distant memory. Sidon the modern, Sidon the industrious, Sidon the trade centre, echoes nowadays with incessant activity typical of Oriental cities.
This is an anthropoid sarcophagus from Sidon. These are the necropolises of Sidon. And here we have Eshmunazar and Tenes.
Far from the bustle of the city, the historian Nina Shedishian has devoted her entire life to the long history of her country.
Sidon was known only through ancient texts. There was no archaeological proof of the city's importance. And then one day, on the 20th of February 1855, a major discovery changed all that.
Aimé Perretier, a diplomat in Beirut at the time, became an archaeology enthusiast, like all enlightened amateurs of his day. He discovered a large sarcophagus of black basalt in the Sidon area. It had clearly been imported from Egypt and bore a long Phoenician inscription, that of Eshmunazar II, king of Sidon in the 5th century BC.
This discovery led to conflict between the French consul and the British consul in Sidon over Perretier's right to keep the sarcophagus. And in the end, Perretier was forced to hand it over to the Louvre. The French government sent the corvette La Sérieuse to Sidon to take the sarcophagus to France. Extensive preparations were made for the delivery of the sarcophagus. It was covered with palm leaves and flowers and pulled down to the shore by 10 pairs of oxen, followed by the governor of Sidon and a crowd of onlookers who'd come to help load the sarcophagus onto the ship. Once on board La Sérieuse, it became the property of France. And Captain Delmas de la Pérouse assembled the entire crew on the deck and read The Curse of Eshmunazar, his voice faltering with emotion.
I beseech every royal family and every man not to remove my coffin. May they be deprived of a tomb. May they leave behind them no son, no heirs. May their children pay for this cursed crime until the extinction of their lineage. As we also discover from the inscription on his sarcophagus, the king of Sidon built a shrine dedicated to the god Eshmun by a spring reputed for its healing powers. At the foot of a vast podium, its many fountains designed primarily for ritual ablutions can still be seen. Legend has it that the god Eshmun loved indulging in the pleasures of hunting. The goddess Astarte, captivated by his radiant beauty, fell passionately in love with him. But to escape her ardor, the young man mutilated his body and died of his wounds. Astarte brought him back to life. As a result, Eshmun took on the role of a healing divinity, the god of fertility and nature that is reborn each year.
This temple, dedicated to Eshmun, became a place of pilgrimage because a god who dies and is resuscitated was seen as a life-giving god. And if a life-giving god, must also be a healing god, able to prevent death and cure disease. Those who most frequently died as a result of illness were children. It appears that children were also cured by immersion in the fountains, and after they were cured, the parents offered up gifts to this god who healed and did good.
Archaeologists discovered many of these offerings, life-sized marble statues of children whose parents had beseeched the god to heal them, or simply to protect them.
These statues are unusual because they reveal a heavy classical Greek influence. Remember, in the 5th and 4th centuries, before the arrival of Alexander, Sidon had close ties with Greece, such close ties that the kings of Sidon were called the Philhellenes, the friends of the Greeks.
This fascination with Greece is even more evident in funereal art. Fashioned most likely by the sculptors of Sidon, white marble sarcophagi display a particularly harmonious blend of Greek and Egyptian influences. The classical Greek facial features are combined with highly stylized bodies reminiscent of the mummies of distant Egypt. Greek influence later extended from the artistic to the political arena. In 333 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the land of Phoenicia. Built on a rocky island that was to give the city its name, Tyre, the mother of Carthage, the arrogant, was at that time one of the most flourishing cities in the world. It was this prosperity that kindled the envy of the great Macedonian general. According to contemporary accounts, the siege of Tyre was long and grim. They described the heroic resistance of the Tyrians, Alexander's terrible rage, and the mammoth destruction of the city. Although sadly nothing remains of Tyre's glorious Greek past, vestiges of the Roman period are still proudly standing. Vast baths, porticos, and above all a majestic colonnade once paved with mosaics, vie in splendour with those of Rome itself. But this willingness to be Romanized did not prevent Tyre from making money. The city's prosperity relied more than ever on shipbuilding and its busy port. Merchants and shipbuilders played a key part in this long-distance trade, which supplied the wealthy customers of all the major Mediterranean cities with oils, cosmetics, and perfumes. But it was thanks to the murex, the shellfish from which the renowned purple dye was extracted, that the workshops of Tyre were famed during the Roman period.
La légende veut que le dieu de Tyr, Héraclès,
Legend has it that the god of Tyre, Heracles Melkart, fell in love with one of the princesses of Tyre. One day he was walking along the beach with her and her dog, when the dog picked up a shell, a murex, which it began to crunch in its mouth.
un murex, et il commence à le broyer avec ses dents. Et tout de suite, ses babines se couvrent d'une teinte.
Suddenly, the dog's jowls were covered in red dye, a dark reddish purple, which the princess adored. And the funny thing about the story is that the princess loved this purple so much that she threatened to jilt her lover if he didn't make her a dress of that color. Heracles ran up and down the beach collecting the shells and crushing them, and when he crushed them, a red dye was released, and he made the princess a dress of that color. And that was the beginning of the purple dye industry. As it was a relatively rare commodity, it was worth its weight in gold, so to speak. The dye was so costly that for centuries it remained the prerogative of the upper middle classes, the nobility and royalty.
Outside the city, the necropolis. "Let us forgive the immoderate use of purple," exclaimed Pliny the Elder in the 1st century, thus stigmatizing the excessive use by many Romans of this costly commodity. Crusher, dyer, murex fisherman. Nearly a fifth of the names carved on the sarcophagi allude to an activity linked to the exploitation of the highly prized shellfish. Not far from the necropolis, immediately after the arches of a giant aqueduct, are the remains of the Tyre Hippodrome. Nearly 500 meters in length, it was one of the biggest in antiquity. People came from far and wide to watch the chariot races, where as many as 12 teams would compete. Separated by flights of steps are 13 rows of seats, or terraces, holding up to 30,000 spectators cheering on their favorite team. Discovered at the end of the 1960s by the Lebanese archaeologist Maurice Shahab, this site, which miraculously escaped bombardment during the war, has nevertheless become an eyesore due to the devastating effects of chaotic urban development. Far from being confined to the coast, there is evidence of Roman influence deep in the heart of the mountains, giving rise to hundreds of little shrines in the interior of the country. These tiny temples, clinging to the sides of the Lebanon mountains, attracted countless worshippers who left offerings, sometimes modest and sometimes quite lavish. Beyond, on the other bank, stretches the fertile Bekaa Valley, the archetypal Mother Earth, the country's grain store. Caravans and invaders used to come and go along this route between Syria and Palestine, passing this holiest of holy cities, Baalbek.
This is the origin of the Roman temples of Baalbek. It is the southwest quarry, what we call in Arabic Eble, a word similar to Heble, which means pregnant woman. The people and the poetic imagination of this people preferred pregnant woman, and they chose to call this rock the Rock of the Pregnant Woman. It is more than 21 meters long and 4 meters wide, which makes a single block of more than 1,000 tons of rock.
Called Heliopolis by the Greeks, the city of the sun did not reach the height of its glory for 3 long centuries, when the Romans embellished it with some of its most magnificent monuments. What more arrogant display of grandiosity and pride than this gigantic temple complex? Baalbek, whose Semitic name betrays its remote origins, was in fact a very ancient Phoenician place of worship. Dedicated to the Heliopolitan triad of Jupiter, Venus and Mercury, there is evidence of the astonishing survival of local deities in the great temple. It was once the shrine of the West Semitic god Hadad, master of lightning and rain, who became assimilated with Jupiter, the Romans' particular favourite. But the best preserved shrine is the one known as the Temple of Bacchus, because of its carved ornamentation. We still don't know to which god it was devoted. Like the building site of a cathedral, it took an army of architects and stonecutters working for more than 10 generations to complete what has to be one of the most ambitious temple complexes of the entire Roman Orient. But from the end of the 3rd century, the Pax Romana, guaranteeing the long prosperity of people and their gods, disintegrated irrevocably. In 394, Christianity became the state religion. Pagan idols were smashed, temples vandalized. Baalbek soon fell into ruin. These are the cedars of Bushari, a deep cleft like a razor cut, splitting the mountain as far as Tripoli. The Kadissa Valley. The mere name stirs a profound emotion in the hearts of all Lebanese Christians. Full of monasteries, chapels and hermitages built into the rock, this deep valley has been home to generations of monks and ascetics from every branch of Christianity since the late Middle Ages. In this remote refuge, prayers could be heard in every language: Greek, Syrian, Arabic, and even Ethiopian.
Le mot Qadisha est un vieux mot syriaque qui signifie sainteté.
The word Kadissa is a Syrian word that means holiness. The valley of Kadissa is the Holy Valley. One of the travellers from the Orient who came here in the 17th and 18th centuries, climbing up the path at the bottom of the valley, made the following observation. From every crack in the rock, every cave, every hole came the smell of incense. I think that image sums up this holy valley, the valley of Kadissa.
For nearly 20 years, Hani Abdul Nur has been exploring every nook and cranny of the Lebanon mountains in the hope of discovering new hermitages. He is struggling to preserve a unique heritage that is fragile and under threat.
Now we've reached one of the most important rock monasteries of the Kadissa Valley. These are adobe walls.
Built under a huge natural porch, Deir es-Salib, the convent of the cross, was a small monastery that probably housed only a handful of monks. But the chapel walls were entirely covered with magnificent frescoes, probably from the 13th century, whose style clearly reveals Byzantine influence.
This is one of the frescoes, the fresco of the Annunciation. Actually, it was vandalized about 10 years ago. The eyes are damaged. You can see the angel Gabriel announcing. The Virgin Mary's disappeared. You can still see a bit of the Virgin Mary's chin. This is one of the finest surviving frescoes in this monastery. The angel's face is really very expressive. Here we can still see part of the saint's fresco, which must have covered the whole of the apse. Sadly, the faces have been vandalized, the eyes, the mouth. You really wonder why. That's St. James, St. Paul, and then there were others that have disappeared. It really is a shame, as it was an absolutely exceptional series. The arrival of the first Christian communities in the Kadissa Valley has been traced back to sometime in the 6th or 7th century. Of course, the Maronite community was here, but there were others. The Nestorians, the Monophysites, the Jacobites, who all settled here and lived in harmony for several centuries. And even later, there were even Ethiopian monks. In the caves here in the Kadissa Valley, we have discovered Ethiopian inscriptions and Ethiopian frescoes dating back to the late 15th century. They show that even monophysites from Ethiopia, from Africa, came here to the valley of Kadissa, which really was a magnet for all those Christian communities seeking mysticism, a more profound spirituality. The surroundings lend themselves to it wonderfully. You are both far removed from the world, but at the same time close to your community.
And yet, a theological argument was to divide all the Christian communities. Sometimes reduced to a handful of followers, these many schools then wore themselves out with arguments as to the true nature of Christ. Was he of divine or human nature, or both? During these troubled times, a new religion emerged to the south, Islam, which spread in the Near East from the year 636. Within a few decades, the Muslim Empire extended from the borders of Spain to the frontiers of China. The new religion soon demanded the construction of large mosques. Built on the foundations of a Byzantine church, the Baalbek Mosque, completed under the Umayyad dynasty, is the oldest mosque still standing in Lebanon today. Currently in the process of restoration, soon it should echo with the sound of chanting and prayer. Some 30 kilometers to the south, near a live spring, a city grew up out of the marshes, Anjar. Although more than a third of the town still has to be unearthed, already houses and shops, a mosque, palace and gardens reveal what was probably a major trade centre at the meeting point of the caravan routes. It was a royal city, opulent and refined. At the heart of his province, the Caliph al-Walid indulged in the pleasures of hunting and poetry. For nearly 3 centuries, the Muslims treated the Christian communities with relative respect, but the arrival of the Seljoukid dynasty put an end to that tolerance. Persecuted, the Christians were barred from the holy places of Jerusalem. This was the reason given by Pope Urban II for launching the First Crusade on the 27th of November, 1095. It was owing to a declining Byzantine Empire and a fragmented Islamic Empire that the First Crusades arrived at the walls of Antioch in 1098. Churches, castles and fortresses sprang up everywhere on the road to the coveted goal of Jerusalem. The countryside was dotted with citadels, watchtowers and chapels, reminding us that this Oriental country also had a Latin period. After a long siege, the Crusaders finally took Tripoli in 1109. The imposing castle built by Raymond of Saint-Gilles still dominates the modern city, but few vestiges of its Frankish heyday remain. When the Mamluks invaded Tripoli in 1289, the Sultan Qala'un immediately ordered the old town to be razed and a new one built at the foot of the fortress. But life was good in this new capital. Tripoli soon became established as an intellectual centre. Mosques and souks, madrasas, theological colleges, and steam baths speak the same architectural language, that of a coherent town plan, proclaiming the glory of Islam. Famous for the quality of their construction and the elegant sobriety of their ornamentation, the facades of the most beautiful buildings have a design based on the alternation of black and white stone. Built in the first half of the 14th century, the Tainal Mosque still has one of the most magnificent monumental doors that has survived from this period. Carved from stone or hewn from marble, the motifs and inscriptions are governed by a highly sophisticated geometric design. But the Mamluk dynasty did not only bequeath its architecture, it also excelled in copperwork, a tradition which the craftsmen of Tripoli have continued ever since. At the dawn of the 16th century, after a long period of domination, the Mamluk Empire was crushed by another great power, the Ottoman Turks. Tripoli still retained a certain prestige. For a long time, travellers from east and west loved to visit the city famed for its silks and cottons, its spices and ice vendors, who were given the poetic nickname of snow merchants. Under Ottoman control, the history of Lebanon unfolded much further south, in the mountain stronghold of the Druze community. Historians generally refer to this complex period as the Lebanon of the Emirs. The Ottoman Sultan entrusted Fakhr ad-Din I, a young prince of the Man lineage, with the government of the Lebanon mountains. Fakhr ad-Din made the little town of Deir el-Kamar his capital, and it soon became the hub of Lebanon.
One of the main princes, the one who is considered to be the founder of modern Lebanon, was Fakhr ad-Din I's grandson, known as Fakhr ad-Din II. It was thanks to him that Lebanon became a state. It was he who opened up to the West and built up friendships and trade relations with Italy, Spain, and the West as a whole. He spent 5 years in Florence, staying with his friends the Medicis. Keen to make Lebanon an independent state within the Ottoman Empire, he sent ambassadors everywhere.
He loved painting, poetry and music, and gave considerable stipends to scholars whom he invited to come from Europe to work under his supervision. The Chevalier d'Avieux wrote of him in the late 17th century. Fakhr ad-Din II. Few men have so embodied the grandeur of Lebanon in Western eyes. It was under his rule that the first printing works in the Arab world was imported from Italy. But above all, this enlightened prince had the wisdom to surround himself with the most competent men in his country, irrespective of their religious faith.
Of course, the Turks weren't happy about this state. They fought Fakhr ad-Din II, and of course they defeated him, appointing his nephew in his stead. The Man dynasty lasted until the end of the 17th century. Then, in 1697, their friends and relatives, the Shihab princes, seized power and held on to it until the middle of the 19th century.
The most prominent prince of this dynasty was, unquestionably, the Emir Bashir II, nicknamed Bashir II the Great. Of the Maronite faith, he forged an alliance with the Druze to try and wrest Lebanon from Ottoman domination. Thanks to this peaceful cooperation, the country went through a period of calm and prosperity. Abandoning the old capital of Deir el-Qamar, Bashir II preferred to reside in a splendid palace which he had built in 1804 on a neighbouring hill. Subtly mixing Oriental and European traditions, the Palace of Beit ad-Din was striking not only for its splendour, but also for its refined decorations. There, Bashir II would forget politics for a while, enjoying the company of men of letters and poets. But the clever strategist made one mistake that was to cost him his power. The unconditional support he gave Muhammad Ali, the Sultan of Egypt when he conquered Syria in 1832, backfired against him. Against a background of a people's uprising, Lebanon lost all its autonomy, and Bashir II was forced into exile. It took nearly 100 years before the country gained that independence so keenly sought by the Emirs. It was granted on the 22nd of November, 1943. Beirut, the capital. If there is a place that epitomizes Lebanese identity, a place where this little country's connection to its distant roots is crystallized, it is the National Museum. Opened in 1939, during the heyday of the French Protectorate, the building was badly damaged during the terrible years of war which destroyed Beirut and battered its population. Between precarious ceasefires and all too rare periods of truce, a handful of people embarked on saving this prestigious heritage under the leadership of Maurice Shehab. One can well understand the pride and emotion of Kamil Asmar, the museum's current director of antiquities, as he's able once more to open the doors of his museum to visitors.
In 1975, when the war broke out, the museum stood on the demarcation line between the two halves of Beirut. It was hell. It was the worst place imaginable. Bombs falling everywhere, occupations. So the former director of antiquities, the Emir Maurice Shehab, closed the museum to the public at once. He began removing the smaller objects and packing them away in cases underground, and then walling in the cases, locking the doors and blocking them up with concrete. As for the large pieces, at first, when he was away, I began surrounding them with sandbags to protect the sarcophagi from shell explosions. The militiamen and soldiers took the sandbags to use as barricades, so when he came back, he had to protect them with wood. They took the wood for firewood, so then he had to encase them in concrete, and that's what protected the museum and these objects against the shells and against the militia occupations of the museum. On opening up the vaults where the museum's collections were locked away, we had a great surprise because there was a lot of damp. There was also water, objects floating in the water, sometimes up to 1 meter deep. So we used the masks to protect ourselves against the damp and the germs down there, and one of our team fell ill down there. So the restoration team began to remove the objects and clean them, remove the salt and repair them, and then restore them. Gradually, with endless patience, we managed to protect and salvage so many objects that were down in the vaults.
Released from their concrete straitjackets, giant sarcophagi, statues and mosaics at last emerged from the dark, after more than 20 years of purgatory. Far away from the whistle of bullets and the chaos of bombs, the capital has already dressed its wounds. Thanks to an energetic building program, the city is rediscovering and exploring its distant past. Famous for its law school dating back to Roman times, the ancient city of Berytus is once again opening the doors of its universities. The coast is once again that place of feasting and pleasure which it should never have ceased being. The tanks have been replaced by cars. The casino sign glitters once more in the dark. Beirut is awakening.